What is up, you sexy people? Today I'm going to show you exactly how we got almost 2 million downloads in the past 2 years on the Noah Kagan Presents show. So first off, when you're starting a show, number one thing you have to do is pick a goal. And so our goal the first year is to get 100,000 downloads an episode. And as you can see by this number right here, we didn't even get close. So I gave up and we lost most of our audience. So the second most important thing in having a podcast is consistency. So with your goals, the goal that we found actually really helpful is just say release one show a week. Because I promise you, it will get really boring. You will want to give up. And the way to win in podcasting is to be consistent with it. So I want to show you our calendar right here. We basically just said, all we have to do is release one episode a week. And as I showed you on the screen before, it was able to grow our show. So you're going to get bored, but pick a goal and be consistent. Number 3 is expanding the pie. So now, whenever I do a podcast, I do a video podcast first. So for instance, this is one I did with Aswath Damodaran. Normally, this would have been a podcast, and it would have gone to around the 5,000 or 6,000 people that watch every single episode. The problem with that is that number doesn't really grow, and it's hard to grow. It's the hardest thing in marketing I've ever done. But YouTube, there's a lot more people out there. It's really easy to search for it. So do videos with every single podcast show you do so that you can expand your pie. Number 4, promotion. So let's think about what Joe Rogan, Pomp, a lot of these guys do is they take these long 2-hour episodes and they cut them up into little chunks. So I definitely think you need to make your appetizers and your entrees. So many people do prey marketing. They say, Noah, I really hope I can put out an episode and get millions of people to watch it. That's not the case. Also, people may not want to devour an hour of time. So what you need to do is say, are there little sections that are really, really powerful like this? So we put it on our LinkedIn page. We put it on our Twitter page. Maybe it's on your Instagram page. I can't tell you how many people lately have been like, oh, I saw this material somewhere. And I was like, that was just supposed to be a podcast. So take out your appetizers, cut them up, and deliver them in nice pieces in different places. But you also need a proactive dashboard. So what the hell is that? A proactive dashboard is basically, what are you actively going to do to promote every single episode? So you can see in like Econ Tips or The Professor, as you saw in that previous thing, we are going to put out at least one tweet, at least one LinkedIn, and other promotions. The important part about this is that things that you can control. You can control your blog post. You can control sending emails. You can control all that. You can't control if you can get a guest or if you can get a backlink, whatever else magical marketing hope. So just make sure that you're promoting the episode because that is probably 80% as important as just recording great quality content. Next up is zero-sum game. So zero-sum game, what the hell does that mean? I always hear it, is that people generally only have this much time available to listen and watch different podcasts. You guys know what I'm talking about. It's generally on the way to the gym, it's way in the grocery store, so your commute. And so people say if they're going to listen to Noah, they're going to have to give up something else. So what does that mean for you? You have to earn that spot. Or as I showed you earlier, if you give up and you stop, someone else will take that over. So my recommendation on the zero-sum game part is go and be very specific with your audience. Because the more compelling you are, like my buddy Elliot Marshall, let me show you him. He is a former UFC fighter and Jewish and a vet. And so he has a very specific audience he can talk to. So my encouragement for him is pick a specific audience that you have access to or control of that no one else can really do better than you have. It is a zero-sum game and realize that. Next up is launch and relaunch. So when I launched my show, we were able to get about 1 million downloads in our first year. And that's not by putting out 10 million episodes and getting one person to watch each one. But we put out quality episodes and we did a huge launch. So what does that mean? I got on other shows. I did a lot of emails. I ran a giveaway. I did a lot of different other activities. And you can read that on sumo.com/stories, how to launch a successful podcast. We'll also put it in the show notes in the description below. But the important thing is not just doing a launch, but it's doing multiple launches. Really? Yeah. So if a launch is a great way of getting people to your show, do more of them. So that is something to really be thinking about, is that how often are you doing a big launch around your show? Next up is celebrities. So I've been able to have, I'm very fortunate, to have Bo Jackson, Mike Posner, Ryan Holiday, Tim Ferriss, and these people that are pretty interesting brand names that people know. What's interesting is that it doesn't drive as many downloads as you might think it will. It generally impacts around 20 to 30%. I thought I got Bo Jackson on the show and I would just get 1 million downloads instantly. That's not the case. So what is the case is that there is name recognition. So if you can use people's names in a positive way, obviously not shady, or get celebrity guests, you'll probably end up getting 20 or 30% more downloads per episode, but it may not make as dramatic effect as you think. What's actually probably more interesting to take away, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is more the titles and thinking about how critical your title selection is when you're making your podcast. And most people aren't really paying attention to that as they're choosing their show. What's more important than actually just putting out your podcast, besides making it really great and unique content, is your email list. Really? I thought we were going to talk about podcasts. So I recommend sendfox.com. It's what I built for my podcast and my show because there's nothing else like there for podcasters and content creators like YouTubers. And so the idea here is that, are you emailing every single show you're putting out? Probably not. Are you actually promoting and saying, hey, on your email signature, on your YouTube, in your description, on your Twitter bio, on your Facebook page, are you saying, hey, come join my newsletter? Probably not. It's much easier to get someone to watch your newsletter and read it than to go download your podcast, check it out, and commit an hour to it. That's a big commitment. That's a full marriage. You got to go on some dates with these people, and you got to let them know repeatedly about the greatness that's in your podcast. And maybe you don't just say, hey, here's an episode, go download it. You just say, hey, here's the 10 nuggets of this episode. If you're interested, click here to go listen to it. So I highly recommend building out your email list using sendfox.com. Next up is be a guest. So this is Harry Campbell, and I did not want Harry Campbell on my show. And it's okdork.com/rideshare-guy. But what Harry did is that he emailed me and said, I know your audience is a bunch of startup people, a bunch of marketing people. Why don't we do an episode of showing exactly how I got 2,000 press mentions? I was like, 2,000? He's like, yeah, I'll give you the exact strategy about how I exactly did it. And so the thing that really stuck with me is that Harry made it easy for me to say yes. And I've been fortunate enough to be on Tim Ferriss's show and Pat Flynn's show and Tony Robbins' show and some of these massive shows, Tom Bilyeu's show. And so I think there's two components of it. Number one, you can't just go ask them for it. You have to be doing interesting things that they want to talk about. And number two, you have to actually let them know, hey, I've got this amazing thing that here's why I think your audience will really enjoy it. And a lot of people, including myself, will just send one email being like a give. Just give me this. I need this. Give me. You know what I'm talking about. So one, build a relationship with them, probably help them out, flatter them. And two, make it something that they are excited to have you on their show. Don't just use your press person sending some generic template that's just going to get deleted. But being a guest is the literal number one way that I have ever seen in growing a podcast, because it's when I think about marketing, I think of medium to medium. What does that mean? Is that you want to do in the same medium that the person's in. Like seeing a billboard is a brand thing. But if you're trying to grow your email newsletter, you want to advertise in other email newsletters because I'm already in it. I can just go to yours. Same with podcasts. I'm listening to a podcast. Let me just go check out this Noah Kagan show. Exactly. So I definitely think being a podcast on other guests, being a guest at other shows is the number one way to actually grow. But it is hard to actually get it on the larger shows. So give yourself time for that. Don't rush into it. Next up is be interesting. So these are the ones that are a little bit more cheesy, a little bit more cliche, but I highly recommend you thinking about is that what are you doing or what have you done that people want to actually hear you talk about? And so that's for your own show or being a guest. And a lot of the shows that I've been on is that I've known people for years. I've even sponsored their shows. I've helped them out in some capacity. I've promoted their shows. Think about what are you doing that is worthy of being on other shows, as well for yourself. What are you doing that's interesting? And if you're not, guess what? Just get started. Go be interesting so that people want to come and find out about you. Next up is finding new audiences. So I think Tim Ferriss has done this really well, where if my niche, I would say, or my audience is people starting marketing businesses and looking to overcome fear in doing those businesses. And that's interesting. But I've actually done Mike Matthews' Muscle for Life, or I've done like cooking blogs and cooking podcasts and YouTube shows for other categories like fishing potentially. Why is that? Because there are people in those categories that are interested in starting and marketing a business. And so think about it as a Venn diagram. You have your audience. What are other audiences that you can expand out to share your messages? Honestly, it'll also be a lot less competitive than you trying to get on the same marketing business shows that everyone else is on. So think about new audiences that you can explore on. So word of cast. Okay, what is word of cast? Think about this. When you are listening or finding out a new podcast, how do most people find out about new shows, right? They find out new shows through their friends, right? Through other people. And so you have to think about, is this something that people will share, or why is this worthy of people sharing, right? So I think you need to really be intentional about when you're creating your word of cast. But it's definitely, I think that and being on other shows is the number one ways that people are growing. I'm coming back to this Aswath Damodaran. This is something I want to really highlight people. It's gateway drugs. So a gateway drug, especially with these podcasts, especially with growing your show, is that asking someone to listen to the show is a big commitment, but having them just like read a tweet is really easy. Or as you can see in my automations on SendFox, when someone joins my newsletter, I'm just going to show you. I have an email that's like, hey, here's me on LinkedIn. Hey, here's my Facebook group, okdork.com/group. Hey, by the way, here is some information. Plus, here's a video that you might want to watch. And then here's a podcast. So my point being is, how do you give people smaller nuggets that they can digest? And then it makes it easier for them to then want to consume more of you. What I found with podcast audience is that the podcast listener is your most loyal person. That's what it is at the end of the day. It's actually not the people don't jump into the deep end. They kind of put their toes in, they get wet. And then as your super fans, that's where your podcast is going to come. So that's why I'm always recommending doing your video podcasting first and cutting those nuggets up, and then doing that before you try to get them to the full podcast. As well as podcasting nuggets. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but podcasting nuggets is how do you take your podcast and repurpose it in smaller chunks? So blog posts, chorus snippets, Instagram stories, Facebook stories, LinkedIn articles, and repurpose them multiple times. Also reuse them. So if you've had older material that worked really well in the past, just go and reuse it. It works really well. Now, I talked about this earlier, and this is probably one of the most critical things in every single podcast that people spend the least amount of time on, and that is your titles. So your titles of your show are key, right? So we spend probably 20 to 30 minutes on every single title, which is crazy to think about. So like my favorite sites to start a side hustle. So we think about the keyword, we think about the clickability, we think about the shareability. And the point I'd really recommend to you is for every single show you're putting out, come with 10 different titles, 10, give me a 10. And think about which one is actually going to be the most compelling. And so this is something and you can even edit these later. So I've gone back on YouTube, on podcasts and all of them, and I re-edit all these single titles to make it really interesting and think about what's compelling. Next up is serialize your show. So serial and what you have to think about is if you look at the top 10 for podcasts, it's pretty much Joe Rogan and then a bunch of NPR series. Dr. John, some doctor thing where someone killed a thing. And so the thing that with it is that it's kind of like a Netflix show and it's a really well-packaged story. So there's a story component and there's a well-packaged kind of narrative. And I think with a lot of interview shows, it's just like, hey, here's an interview with another person that you've all heard about before. And so think about, well, the best guys and girls are all doing these serial style shows. Maybe that's something for you to think about exploring with a 3 to 5 part segment. Like, hey, I'm going to show you in 5 episodes how I made $100, or I'm going to show you how I get rid of pimples, or I'm going to show you how to build a garden or build this van. And it's a 5-part series. So I definitely recommend thinking about serializing your show. Next up is your angle, right? So if you think about my angles and things like that, I've tried a bunch of different angles, but an angle is thinking about what's the angle of your audience that's really compelling. So is it doing book reports? Like I tried book reports and people were okay with it. I've tried different live case studies. We did Noah's Ark, and that actually got a great response. And I think what you have to really keep doing is, why is someone going to listen to you, right? Think about it. Why are they listening to me? You're listening to me because I've done certain things at appsumo.com and with sendfox.com and with our different businesses that you want to learn so that you can do it for yourself. And so you really need to think about, you're not going to beat Joe Rogan. You're not going to out Noah Kagan, but no one can out you. So you just need to think about your own voice and your own angle for what you're going to be doing. Next up is pre-show calls to action. So if on every website, you mostly always click on the top third, and most people don't even read or get to the bottom. That's the same thing with your podcast show. It's really important to think about, what am I asking the audience to do in the beginning? Because by the end of your show, if you're putting all your calls to action, if you're putting all the links there, ain't no one doing nothing. So there's two kind of key things with that. Number one, don't overload the beginning so I don't get to the meat. You know, on YouTube and podcasts, people have huge drop-offs. I was just looking at it. About 30% of my listeners drop off in the first 10 seconds on YouTube. So I have 10 seconds to get them to come in and want to watch this stuff. By now, they're not actually listening. So think about, number one, get them in the first 10 seconds. But number two, put your calls to action so there's things for them to do in those first 10 seconds. You get what I'm talking about. Next up is manual download. So if you're meeting someone in person and you have your phone out, literally say, hey, do you have a phone? Can I just get you to download the podcast? Let's just do it. Subscribe. Here's my favorite 2 episodes. Done. I know it's kind of a stupid one, but if you're trying to grow your podcast, this is especially for smaller ones, everyone counts one by one. Last up is your email signature. So in mine right now, I have my newsletter, sendfox.com/Noah, which is important to me. You should put your podcast. So go into your Gmail settings, scroll down to signature, and put your podcast. Every single email, you get free listeners, and you don't have to do anything. All right, next up, some of the things that have not worked. All right, so a lot of these things, these are exact things that have worked, and they've all worked at different levels. So things that have not worked, number one, guest promotion. I go on a lot of shows, and I still ask people to come on my shows, but every time someone's like, Noah, can you email this to your audience? I'm like, no, the whole point for me coming on your show is to get a new audience for myself. And so there's definitely a balance of power, but do not count on it. Do not ask for it. And think about it this way. How would you make it exciting for the guests to want to share it? Maybe you draw an image for them. Maybe you cut out and make this really cool animation for them. Maybe you wrote out this blog post that makes them look really good. One of my favorite marketing strategies is called testimonial marketing. And the idea there is, how do you become a testimonial for someone to make them look good so that they actually want to promote you? And by that, you actually get promoted. So don't expect guests to promote your shows. Number two, show notes. So we've written all these show notes, Bo Jackson show notes, all the show notes. If you go to Google Analytics, they get ultimately almost no traffic. It's insane. So one thing is that it's almost not worth doing show notes. Don't do a blog post, because guess what? It costs time and money to do those. And so you really have to be thinking about, if I'm doing a blog post to have the show, is this really going to be something people are going to Google and share? If not, don't do it. It's not even worth it. And last up is advertisements. I've advertised on Overcast. I've advertised on listennotes.com. And for me, it has not worked. I think what's a better use of advertising, and what I'm doing today, is I'm advertising Facebook ads to join my newsletter, or Facebook ads to my really strong content. And my strong content has an opt-in for the email. And so what I recommend is doing that, get them on your newsletter, have an automation, as I showed you guys earlier, where it's like, oh, here's some of the little nuggets that are really great. And then you could say, hey, if you're interested in more, here's my podcast. But trying to get them to go right into a podcast, even from the places that people are listening to, I found it's really expensive. It's about $10 a listener, and it's really hard to scale and make that effective. So advertisements have not worked. Next up, I want to talk about some tools and trends as you're growing a small podcast. As you grow a podcast, number one I've used is Zencastr. So what this does, and the reason that I really highly recommend it, is that it's great to get local audio from your guest. And so if you're doing Zoom or if you're doing Skype, those are really great options to do it. But as well, I have people do this as a backup to make sure that when it's done recording, there's a secondary audio. So just in case Zoom messes up, it doesn't break, and make sure that the quality is good. The other thing here is that click the little settings icon when you go into Zencastr, and make sure you disable built-in VoIP. Otherwise, they hear audio echoing. But Zencastr is highly recommended, really good for audio quality, and just a great insurance. Because I'll tell you, I do some of these interviews, and I get scared as hell. I'm like, holy shit, please record. Please let that record. Next up, I really recommend and highly use is Descript.com. I interviewed the founder, Andrew Mason. This guy is totally amazing. I love these guys. And it's really like revolutionary in how people can edit their podcasts. It does text. You can edit the text really cool and move it all around. We do this on every single show, which is editing these transcripts to make the show so much stronger. So I highly recommend you check out the Descript.com. We use it to make it easy to find, like, okay, what were the 3 key things in every episode? What are the summary and descriptions? What are the intros and outros? So Descript.com is definitely a great way as well to do that. So podcast topics. I'm just going to do this straight up with me and you looking. You can look at ahrefs.com. You can use Google Trends. You can look at SEO and all these different things. What I've really found is there's kind of like 3 things. There's the topic, there's the audience potential, and then there's the guest. And so I think you really have to figure out your balance of, like, am I just trying to get the biggest audience possible, which is challenging? Is it certain topics that are more interesting? Is it SEO? And so ultimately what you're doing, you can build out a formula. But I think for me, at the end of the day, what I figured out in terms of the podcast topics is, who am I excited to talk about? Which topics am I excited to talk about? And then in terms of audience size, I don't really think about it that much. I think about, for me, the shows that I personally have enjoyed the most. It's easy for me to share them. And I think the audience, you listening or hearing or watching, is excited to consume it because I'm enjoying it. And I think I would focus more on that versus, let me get the biggest guests, let me focus on SEO and all these other things. I think the SEO component is important, but do that after you kind of made the show, not necessarily before it. What I like to do with a lot of my shows, and I can show you with the Tim Kennedy example. So if you look down here on the Tim Kennedy example, whenever I do a show, so for the Tim Kennedy example, what I like to do for my shows is I think about what's the title. I always remind myself, go for the story. And I have a bunch of questions that I like to do. And generally what I think about is, what are the 3 questions, if I only get 3, that I'm going to ask? And that is a really great way to structure your podcast topics. One other thing that I've found recently that I've been doing in almost every one of my shows is that if it's a guest-based show, I try to compliment them right away, or how they've impacted my life. So I told him, like, his sheepdog response course was a game changer for me. And so when you say that to a guest, I learned that from the Jeff Ross, because I didn't do that until the end. They feel really good. They get excited. It builds a relationship, and it's a great way for them to start opening up to you, because most shows, the first 10 minutes is just a wash. It's actually the last 15 minutes that it's like after 30 minutes where they get comfortable to start sharing the good stuff. But I found this is kind of like an accelerant for that as well. If you want to talk with me about this or get involved in your shows, it's okdork.com/group is where I interact with people. Last up is a podcast icon. So this is kind of an interesting one, but if you look at podcast icon, and I'll show one other thing, like you see this one, or you see like maybe the Noah Kagan Presents. So think about your logo and your podcast icon and podcast design. Go look at your category in iTunes and then see how many other people look similar to you, because you'd kind of want to distinguish yourself, y'all. Look at this. Tim looks the same. Gary looks the same. Life Coach, Rachel Hollis looks the same. Leveling Up, everybody's looking the same. So think about what's your color. Think about your podcast logo, your podcast design, and how you are distinct. I like my tacos. I eat a shit ton of them. So that's kind of my thing in a lot of it, which is a taco icon. But go look at that. And the last thing I would recommend is chartable.com. So Chartable is a really cool way. My buddy Dave built it. Really cool stats for podcasts. And I don't think a lot of people actually use this. I know Libsyn is where I host it. But Chartable is an amazing way to actually just edit your stuff. And so go check out chartable.com, free to use. So look, podcast is fun and I've given up, right? And it's easy to give up. And so for you, I think you have to figure out what is something, you can figure out the why, and I'm not going to talk about that, but just think about with the show, it's like, how can I do something that's sustainable and enjoyable? And I promise you, if you're able to continually put out content, continually keep improving, and you do it for 10 years, you'll get the results you want. I promise you. All right, guys, I love you. See you out there.